Hey, good morning, guys. It's Doc Hollis here. Wanted to set you up for yet another entry into our study of the wonderful world of apologetics. Again, if you are not a part of this ongoing class, I'd love to have you be a part of it. Go ahead and check us out over at Sunbreak Baptist Church. We're over on Yelm Highway. This is a part of an ongoing series that we've been covering everything from evolution, morality, ethics, things of that nature, and how it all relates to our study and why we can actually have a true and honest faith and belief in the Bible and the God of the Bible as he is presented. One of the things that we try to deal with are some of the various questions that come up as Christians that, man, it's just really difficult to try to understand sometimes. As I've mentioned before, a lot of my background, a lot of my challenges was in having been a Zen Buddhist before, having been someone who was really just challenged as a kid trying to find faith, growing up in a family that had no faith. So maybe you're blessed and you grew up in the church and this is something that's just old hat to you. Or maybe you were like me and maybe you're someone who didn't really come to know God or Jesus until a little bit later on in life. This, again, is going to be part 2. We're diving into why you can believe in the Bible. Would love to have you check out part 1, and we posted that last week at our Sunbreak Church website. So please feel free to check that out. If you're really bored and you want to just listen to some wild and crazy rantings, please feel free to check me out at the Stoic Sasquatch and Sasquatch Coaching. It's my podcast. It's a little crazy. Would love to hear feedback on that, especially in the middle of all this coronavirus nonsense. This is one of those things where boy, it just seems like now more than ever, we need God. We need to understand and appreciate what God is doing for us because there's a lot of people right now who are suffering. One of the things that came up this week was unemployment claims at 3.2 million people. I mean, 3.2 million, that's just amazing. That many numbers of people just being out of work. It impacts even my own house where we're, either put on low census or having to deal with the fact that, maybe we're just not going to be able to get enough hours, that kind of thing. So I know it's impacting all of you. And there are a lot of people who are crying out about, almost the same cry that the Jews cried out so many centuries ago and during different times in our history. Where's God? What's he doing? Why is he allowing this to happen? And so I answer that in the podcast. And one of the things that I want to put forward here just for your consideration is, what if what he's trying to teach us is more about what we should have been doing? Emergencies come and go all the time. There have been pandemics throughout our history. There have been world wars, things of that nature. And time again, people have to relearn the lesson to be good stewards of what he has given us. That includes money, water, and for heaven's sakes, toilet paper. But in all of it, we have to also take another look at the fact that, are we actually grateful for the things that we do have? Are we grateful for our spouses, for our children, for the roof over our head? There's so many things that are actually going right now that most people just don't even think about it. So with that, I want to dive into a little bit about what we covered last week, and then just kind of get excited about some of the things and additional reasons on why you can believe in this Bible and how it further shows evidence that God is unique, God is amazing, and why you should have just an amazing faith in him because he really never fails us. May not always be in the timing that we want, but he never fails us. So start right off with, what is the Bible? The Bible is a collection of canonized texts that are the basis for our belief in a single, unifying, omnipresent, omnipotent, monotheistic faith. This is a God of justice. This is a God who was the first one out of all of those ancient gods that people put forward and had created with their own hands. A God who believes in right and wrong. He shows that there is justice, that there is going to be someone's going to be punished when they're truly horrible to you, so to speak. And the Jews, especially, were finding that to be the case. When we start to deal with the Old Testament, we're taking a look at what happens in the time of Pharaoh and the people being held as slaves for several hundred years, and people having forgotten what Joseph had done for the Egyptians. I mean, this is just one of those things where, could you imagine whole generations being stuck and serving as slaves and constantly crying out for a God who maybe you think doesn't listen? And then you're like looking at all of these other gods and thinking, well, maybe if I create this cool little statue of clay and I worship that, that maybe that's going to help me. Maybe the Egyptians had it right. And what we see in the Old Testament is God, especially through the times of the 10 plagues, he goes through and decimates, absolutely decimates what people thought to be true as the local gods during the Egyptian time period. Now, the Bible contains a lot of different things. It contains history, poetry, prophecy, philosophy, a lot of wisdom text. Um, and so I've told people often, if you're going to start with anything, especially as a business owner, start with Proverbs. Um, Learn to appreciate some of the wisdom that's there because it holds true in how you manage your relationships with people, employees, other businesses, that sort of thing. It's written by over 40 authors over a span of 1,500 years. And these authors are from various different demographics. I mean, you had kings, you had um, lowly fishermen, so to speak. You had individuals who, across the gambit, were either soldiers, poets, prophets, um, singers, individuals who all contributed. But what's weird is that these 40 different authors all wrote parts of a story that somehow all knit together perfectly. And that just doesn't happen. It's written to reach all generations. It's not just ancient ones. And all you have to do is really look at the language. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into that today. Um, it's written in a way that doesn't matter what generation, you can come back to it and see truth in it. So, as an example, while a lot of people get hung up in like the first 6 days of creation, one of the things you have to ask yourself is, who is this being written for? These are being written for individuals who are in the middle of the Bronze Age. They're not going to understand quantum physics. They're not going to understand astrophysics. They're not going to understand what a quark is or a boson-Higgs particle or anything else. And so it's written in a way and a language that the average person would truly grasp and understand. I mean, if you think about it, there aren't that many people today who would even understand what a boson-Higgs particle is, let alone what quantum physics, string theory, chaos theory, or any of these other things would actually mean, or how you calculate some of these different algorithms that even are associated with things that go on with your Google search. It's, as a book, even the last book of the New Testament is older than 2,000 years old. The earliest book of the Old Testament is over 3,500 years old. And it served for the basis of modern science starting in the 17th century, based on an unchanging God of order, purpose, and consistency. Now, it's unique in its continuity, it's unique in its circulation. No other book has really reached as many continents, countries, and areas of the world ever. It's unique in its translation. It's been written in over 1,400 different languages at this point. It's unique in its survival. One really only has to look at the Jewish people even to say, it's miraculous that they have survived with their original language intact to reclaim and be a part of Israel, where they as a people were even born. There's no other people or culture on the planet that can claim that. It's unique in its survival. Everybody has tried to destroy this thing. They've attacked it. And every so often you'll hear, here's the doom and gloom about the Bible. This is why you can't believe the Bible. And then later on, only to find out, oops, yeah, archaeology reproved all of that history. Oops, yeah, hey, look, here's David's temple. Oops, here's where we found in Jerusalem. Oh dear, look at all this truth that we found about this segment of the history. Hey, look at prophecies about Tyre and things of that nature. So this book has been under more attack than any other book in history, and yet it's withstood all of it. to include people like Diocletian, who in AD 300 decided to burn all of the books that he could put his hands on. Voltaire during the 1500s was an individual who tried leading astray a whole lot of people through his French revolutionary philosophies and things of that nature. And 50 years after his death, the Geneva Bible Society would convert his home into a Bible printing press in a just a unique sense of irony. Now, the big picture, again, it's written over 1,500 years, 60 generations, 40 plus authors, different walks of life, different places, different times, different moods, different continents, 3 different languages, writing on hundreds of controversial topics, brought together in an absolute harmony from beginning to end. This isn't like Buddhism, where it's some single prince who's stepped out and now the writings are about him and his philosophies and his ideas. It's not about one guy who went out in the desert and supposedly heard all of this information from a single angel. Now, that could apply to Joseph Smith, that could apply to Muhammad, because both claim to receive all of their information from a single angel, either Gabriel or Moroni, golden tablets, things of that nature. Yet, in all of these cases, they're a single individual talking about a single source of information. Whereas with the Bible, you have all of these different authors, and all of it shows incredible continuity and is validated by archaeology. Now, there are a few tests. How do we know what we have is accurate? How do we know what we're reading is valid? So you have the textual test. Now, this is where we're looking for errors between manuscripts, copies, originals, that sort of thing. We have the bibliographical test. How much time and how many manuscripts do we have? From the time that it originally happened to the time that it was actually put to words, and then we started making copies about it, how much of that do we actually have? Well, when we take a look at this, we have everything from Plato, Herodotus, Aristophanes, Sophocles, Tacitus, Julius Caesar, Pliny the Elder. We can show that from the time of the original to the earliest manuscript, and that gap can be quite significant, and yet we give a whole lot of credence and treat all of these writings as being valid. And then we take a look at, well, how many manuscripts do we have from all of this? And if you look near the bottom of this graph, you'll see, as it relates to the Greek New Testament manuscripts, and then the non-Greek New Testament manuscripts, those written in Latin, as an example, you'll see that we have upwards of 66,000 plus total Bible manuscripts. I mean, that's crazy. No one else has that. So why do we have so many versions? What's that all about? Well, each translation is written for a unique group of people. Sometimes we had to rewrite it because, man, no one writes and reads as if we're in ancient Shakespearean time. So we don't talk in terms of these, thous, and those, and that sort of thing. So if you look here at the translation comparisons, we can go all the way from a word for word translation, which is the interlinear, to the New American Standard, King James Version, all the way over for thought. So that's where we get into like the NIV. And then we can go all the way over to the paraphrased version, like the Message. Now, each one of these has value. And so depending on where you're starting at, if you've never read the Bible and you have like no background or an interest in reading some deep scholarly discussion about things, start with the Message. Start there, and then hopefully from there, that leads you to want to read one of these earlier versions, the NASB or King James Version or New King James Version, that's going to give you more of a word for word translation, so that you can sort of say, oh, so this content hasn't changed, the thought hasn't changed, but these are the exact words that were said. And also understand that sometimes trying to translate something into English, it just doesn't work well. One of the stories that I tell often is my experience that when I was in Kazakhstan, a friend of mine, he decided to help me out. He knew that I was going crazy, and he said, look, I'm going to take you to church. It's this great bilingual church. And he was right. It was a bilingual church. We go in, and the pastor is speaking in Russian. His wife is speaking in Kazakh. She's translating for everyone else. And then he had been very kind and put a university student sit next to me. And she was then in turn translating everything into English for me. Well, things like the word disciple, it, you don't have a word for that in Russian, and you don't have a word for that in Kazakh. So the translation for them is student. Now, are there differences? Yeah, a bit, but not enough to make um, to really get your knickers in a wad about, so to speak. Are these individual students? Yes, but it's different in the sense that they want to be so like Christ that the level and depth of being a student is a bit different. Now, canon. This one's a hot topic. A lot of people get kind of really bent out of shape when they try to understand why were certain books included and why were certain books not? Who made those decisions? What right did they have to make those decisions? Are they hiding something? Well, we have to look at like what's the origin of all of this. A canon comes from the root word reed. Now that's the English word cain, Hebrew for gana, and Greek form canon. It's reeds were used as measuring rods, just a measuring stick, if you will. Now, during the 3rd century, one of the early church fathers, Origen, used the word canon to denote what we call the rule of faith, the standard by which we measure and evaluate everything that may be offered to us in the article of our belief. Now, later on, the word canon just kind of meant list or an index, if you will. Understand, this is where we have to like parse words, really separate kind of some of the issues. The church did not create the canon. It did not determine which books would or, be called scripture and or are considered these are inspired by God. Instead, what the church did was recognize or discover which books had been inspired from their very inception. So we had to come up with a few tests for that. Why? Was the book written by a prophet of God? Was the writer confirmed by acts of God? Now, what do we mean by that? Moses, his miracles, Elijah coming up against the priests of Baal, that sort of thing. Did the message tell the truth about God? Does it come with the power of God? Well, how does the Bible have a power of God? Is it living and active? Is it transformative? Does it impact you? Does it change you? When you read it, does it make you want to do things differently? And was it accepted by the people of God? Now, there's some other ones that are out there, and people get confused about these. One of them is called the Apocrypha. Now, these are writings or statements, mainly when we say dubious authenticity, basically it's they don't know who wrote them. And sometimes the origins are pretty doubtful as well. Now, there are Old Testament ones, and some of those they identified as, being written in Greek instead of being written in Hebrew. So that was one of the reasons why they weren't included. As an example of that, you have the Maccabees. Now, these are the stories of the Hellenistic Jews. And so for the Old Testament collection of what's recognized, it's one of those that are like, okay, well, yeah, this is kind of Jewish history, but in the grand scheme of things, we're not sure that this should be included, and we're really not sure who wrote this. So that creates a problem. Gnostic. Now, the Gnostics are a couple of different types of writings that can create a whole lot of problems all on their own. You have the Jewish version of this, and this is called the Kabbalah. And it's these are Hebrew mystics. Basically, they're saying, look, we have to interpret scripture only through esoteric methods and ciphers, and only if you have the secret magical doctrine can you properly interpret the Bible. Well, yeah, malarkey. Gnostic refers specifically to 1st century individuals who they decided that through their ancient religious ideas and systems, that everything should be this personal mysticism, that they were convinced that all matter is evil and that the emancipation doesn't come through Jesus Christ as a personal savior. Rather, it comes through gnosis, mystery. It comes through the creation, and the whole universe is defiled, and therefore it's only through your personal experience that you're taught the ultimate end would overcome matter, and you would be reunited with parent spirit and realm of light and energy, and you could awaken the God from within yourself. The first time I read this, I absolutely thought of Scientology. Sorry, guys. A lot of the second century Christian Gnostic teachers were mixing like all kinds of mythology with even Plato's metaphysical speculations. We are one with the universe, that kind of thing. Any of this sound familiar? Like, oh, I don't know, transcendental mysticism, meditation, and the New Age movement? This stuff's been around forever. People have been trying to say that you needed something more to be saved than Jesus ever said. Jesus made it simple. God made it simple. Believe in him. He's the door. You can't save yourself. As humans, we're too flawed. We make too many mistakes. There's no way for us to actually save ourselves. But these Gnostics and the Kabbalah, they're telling you differently. They're saying, yes, you can save yourself. You too can be like God. Well, I only have to get through the first couple of chapters of Genesis to read that. That's kind of the first lie, that we can be like God. I don't want to be like God. God's job is too big. I really like the idea of being saved, though. And so I really like the idea of not having to rely completely on myself to actually save myself. That makes a huge difference. So for me, I look at these things and I can see that there's a different kind of influence in them, an influence that's not healthy. Now, when we say, was it recognized by early church fathers? What we have here is a chart of all of the earliest church fathers, to include Clement of Rome. So this is 95 AD. And what he had, what you see in the little red squares or little red Bibles, are the copies of the books that he had. And so as you look across the top, you have the different church fathers: Lyons, Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus, Irenaeus, Origen, Tertullian. And what versions did they have? And this was one of the challenges early on, because not everyone had a full set of copies of everything of the New Testament. Now, who accepts the Apocrypha? Now, these again are the non-recognized writings. Now, you have the Roman Catholics. They have Tobit all the way down to Maccabees. You have the Greek Orthodox. They have their own versions. You have the Russian Orthodox, and then you have the Coptic Christians. Now, no canon or council of the Christian church recognized any of the books of Apocrypha as inspired for nearly 4 centuries. And they weren't recognized by the Jewish scholars at all. In fact, what you have from the Old Testament is basically what was genuinely accepted and used all the way up through 70 AD at the time of the destruction of the temple. And so the Jewish scholars, these are well-practiced, well-versed, what has been maintained for hundreds of years at the time that Jesus comes on the scene. Now, the Apocrypha basically at this point is not pulled into play as something that people want to embrace until the Pope does it in the 1500s. Now, many of you may not be familiar with what was going on in the 1500s in Italy. This is the time of the 3 popes. You have the Medians, who are fighting about who should have power over the Roman Catholic Church as it relates to Rome and Italy, and what was going on with the Medicis and so many of the others throughout Rome, Florence, and different parts of Italy. There were a lot of just ongoing battles. A lot of our great artwork from the Renaissance time period is coming out of that time period, because there are all these people who are trying to show why their group of church believers is better than the other group of church believers. So part of what came out of all of this was that suddenly the Roman Catholic Church says, fine, we're going to embrace the Apocrypha and incorporate it into the teachings as a way of almost a counter-Reformation movement. Now, why do we even pull together a New Testament? The reasons for the collection of that was, they were prophetic. Paul's writings, Peter's writings, John's later's writings, the book of Revelations, Colossians, things of that nature, they all talk about the second coming of Christ. They talk about what's in the future. There's also the needs of the early church. The churches needed to know which books should be read, which ones should be revered, which ones should be applied. Now, not everyone had a copy of all the writings. Some only had parts. Maybe they only had phrases. Sometimes they only had a single letter. And so it was going to be important to try to gather it all together in one unit in order to share out to all of these churches to help make everything more standardized. And we had also at the same time period the rise of the heretics and the rise of the Gnostics. Later, we'd have the issues with Diocletian around 300, where, there needed to be a clear collection of writings that conveyed the truth. We had the circulation of really spurious writings. Now, these are churches in the East that had started to include apocryphal writings, to include even some that were almost demonic. And so there needed to be a cleanup on that part too. Missions. Christianity was spreading rapidly and needed to be translated into local languages. And so you have to decide, what am I going to translate? Wycliffe faces this daily right now as a part of their ongoing mission to make translations of the Bible available to every language in the world. And so if we don't know what books should be translated, that also creates a problem. Where do you spend your energy? Now, again, by 70 AD, the Old Testament and the destruction of the temple, these were the final accepted books of the Old Testament. These are the ones we said, hey, we've been talking about these for hundreds of years. These are the ones that we accept. And so across the top here are the Hebrew words for these segments. So you have the Torah, that's the law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. You have the Nevi'im. Now, these are the writings of the prophets. You have the former prophets, the latter prophets, sometimes called the minor prophets. And then you have the Kethuvim. And this is the writings of Job and Proverbs, and basically your wisdom writings, Lamentations, and you have also prophecies included in Daniel and things of that nature. Now, there is other evidence on why we should support the way these things were written. So as an example, why do we have these three broken up segments of the Old Testament? Well, we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated at 150 BCE. You see that the writer there is pointing out, we have written to you so that you would understand the books of Moses and the books of the prophets and of David. You have from Ecclesiasticus, 130 BC. He references a threefold section in his writings as he is translating what his father, Jesus ben Sirach, had written in Hebrew. So he is going to be writing it out as the histories and writing out these things into Greek, what he knew from Hebrew. You have Philo, who is a Jewish philosopher around the time of Jesus. He confirms the three different sections. You have Josephus. Now, he's a first century Jewish historian who you're going to hear about again, because he talks a lot about Jesus and what was going on for the Jews during the time period of this segment of the Roman Empire. You have the Talmud. This is an ancient collection of rabbinical laws and interpretations and commentaries on the law of Moses. Now, again, the law of the very first 5 books of the Bible. One of the compilations is 350 AD. The other one is from 500 AD. And then you have on top of that the Mishnah. And now the Mishnah is a collection of oral laws that was compiled around 200 AD. All of these are in agreement about what's included in the Old Testament. Then is what further supports what we would later say is the quote-unquote canon of the Old Testament. Now, I'm going to have to wrap it up, keeping it kind of short this time, because the next 2 topics are just so big. One of which is, are there contradictions in the Bible? Is there something there that we should be worried about? And what are some of the problems for Christians that we face as we start to believe in the Bible? So with that, I wanted to leave you with something that I came across that was kind of interesting, hopefully something that'll inspire you as you're stuck at home. This is what a group of individuals in Nashville, a bunch of studio singers, did with their at-home time.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my life thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well assurance, control. That Christ hath regarded my helpless estate, and hath shed his own blood for my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. With my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. My soul. It's well. The day when my faith shall be signed. The clouds be rolled as a scroll. This cloud shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. He's well with my soul. It is well with my soul. With my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. My soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. My soul is well. It is well with my soul.
Wow. I don't know about you, but that sort of thing always peps me up a little bit and helps reassure me that even when I'm not in control, even with so many things spinning out of control, things are well with my soul. I know my Savior. I know my God. I know that He can be relied on. I know He can be depended on. And I know that He has told me so many times there is no reason to fear, that He has plans not to forsake us, but to prosper us. And I believe that wholeheartedly. So I hope that this helped for today. Again, love just being able to be a part of this with you. And I hope that you have a great rest of the week.